Let's take a look around the finished build, starting with the case mods. So we've modified every single panel in this case except for the rear panel, and we've also added some panels. By the way, this fan down here is faulty. We're going to replace that shortly. Now, we're finding consistently with a lot of the mid-tower cases that are currently on the market that the radiator specifications are not always correct. I mean, you'd be okay in this case mounting a 240mm and a 360mm radiator without mods. But even the slimmest 360mm radiators on the market, and the smallest, which is what we have here, if you want to fit two of them, it definitely requires a lot of mods to the front and top panel. So this radiator is actually sitting down on the bottom panel as low as we can get it. Yet still, there's only about 2mm of room up here for the fittings. For the top radiator, there is a bit more leeway, but we had to push it out to the edge to fit the motherboard, the memory, everything up behind it. So these mods are usually fairly straightforward. It's just a matter of a lot of test fitting and measurements to get the positions of the radiators. But there's a lot of other things that need to line up. For example, you have the outer cover panels. So, there's holes here. You have the front I/O. We have to change the position of the power button and attach it to the top cover panel instead of the top panel. So that all just requires a whole lot of test fitting, reassembling the case, pulling it apart again, building the system, pulling it apart again. So yeah, it's just a lot of test fitting to get everything to fit and to line up and to work, which is always the case with mods. I mean, people have asked me about kind of doing all this in CAD, but yeah, that's expensive, it's time consuming. And in CAD, you don't always pick everything up. I mean, in the real world, and when you start building, there are just so many variables that you cannot take into consideration, like the way that tube bends and the way that cables bend, and that all requires real life experience. So the customer wanted a full Psu shroud that goes all the way through, and this is actually a very complex component because of all of the bits of plastic and screws that actually hang through. So there's a whole lot of cutouts across the bottom there where it's touching and attaching to the bottom panel, little notches and things to get it to fit. It attaches at the front here, wraps around the radiator, attaches at the front again there at the back, attaches all the way across the bottom of the motherboard tray, where we have a nice big cutout where the motherboard actually hangs through, which works out really nicely because it shrouds all of those connections across the bottom of the motherboard, which are ugly, all of the front panel connections, audio, USB. And then if you need to access those later, like now, after the loop is full, normally you would have to remove the GPUs, which requires draining the loop, because you can see you just can't get your hand under there to make the connections. But we've actually designed it so that you can make the connections from around the back. The gap is big enough. We also have the cutout there for the Aquarius 6XT. And the PCIe cables go down vertically, which is a huge help because you can see with the SATA data there and the pump and res combo going around the side really wouldn't work. It would just be too tight. So we then have the motherboard tray mods. We have a section added here to give us a nice clean surface for perfect cable routing, properly positioned, and also for the pump and res combo. So in this build, I wanted to do something different for the pump and res combo because it only has a single loop. If it had dual loops, we would have to mount them onto the radiator, and you've seen us do this many times before. And this would also mean that the Psu shroud would only be able to come to here to allow room, because the pump and res combos would kind of be out here. And it would also take the loop down into the lower compartment here, but we had to fit the Aquarius 6XT, and there's also SSDs mounted down there, so there wasn't enough room. So I wanted to keep the loop confined to this main compartment. Being a single loop, it's short, it's clean. Having it all in this main compartment definitely works a lot better. So we used a Singularity Computers 200mm reservoir, black acetal. We used the triple port cap because there wasn't enough room for the quad port cap here unless we dropped down to a 150mm reservoir. And we used a DDC acetal black mod kit. Again, Singularity Computers Protium, ethereal single black reservoir mounts. And yeah, mounting it to that back panel instead of the radiator worked out quite nicely. I mean, we could have done it either way, but it was just something a little different. And there was plenty of space back there to mount it. But you'll be able to see all of that better when we take a look from around the back how that panel works. So let's take a look at the loop. Now we have Singularity Computers acrylic tube, Bits Power black sparkle fittings, all 16mm hardline compression fittings. We have a mini D-plug and a mini valve here. We come across into the bottom of the GPUs with two 90-degree singles, parallel configuration, 10mm extension, 90-degree single, another one going into the CPU block, 10mm extension and 90-degree single coming out, straight into the top 360mm radiator, 10mm extension and 90-degree dual rotary, then across and into the other 360mm radiator with a T-fitting, a male-to-male fitting, and that is actually for a temp sensor. It was the only place that I could put it. I mean, we do have a free port back there on the res, but if there's any air up there, then it's not going to work properly. We also have two free ports on the Protium DDC Black Acetyl mod kit, but the temp sensor is too deep. When we designed all of our components, we took away as much material as possible. I mean, I wanted them to be as small and as streamlined as we could possibly get them. And so only some temp sensors actually fit in our DDC pump top. There's just not the depth for them. So the coolant is Mayhem's X1 with Mayhem's orange dye. I added about half a bottle, which seems like a lot, but you know, with those dyes, you just keep adding them until you get the colors that you want. You can mix them together. You can use them with all of the different Mayhem's products, with other different brands. They have high quality non-stain dyes available if you are worried about that. But I've found that, you know, the staining issues are not too bad. You do have to watch out with the UV pink, and that really tends to stain. At least well, you can get the non-stain version as well, but we have Mayhem's Aurora Silver Booster as well, which you can see there. I actually have builds out there that have been running for 8 years with Mayhem's coolant without a coolant change, and I've never had any problems with Mayhem, so I'm very confident in their products. So let's take a look at the lighting. We have a single dark side 30cm RGB LED strip at the top here, which I've set to orange. We have the lighting on the motherboard, which is obviously RGB, but I've set that to orange. We have white lighting on the Corsair Dominator Special Edition memory, and we would have lighting on the SLI bridge, except that I cut it. Now, the reason I did that is because these Asus SLI bridges just keep cycling through RGB. Even if you have the cables connected, you have the Aura software installed, they just don't seem to work. There's a glitch with the Aura software. I hope Asus fixes this soon, but what I'll do is add a brand new SLI bridge before I ship the system, connect the cable, so it'll be cycling through RGB until Asus fixes that problem, and then the customer will be able to adjust it. I mean, most of the customers just set it to cycling through RGB anyway, because everyone loves RGB at the moment. So let's take a look at the custom paint. I did something a little bit different for this build. Because of the Anvil logo, I had to do a DuPont black base coat and then DNA matte clear coat. And that's because first the base coat goes down, then the Anvil logo, which is DNA Silver Flare Silver Metallic and DNA Candy Orange Candy. And then the clear coat, which is matte, goes over the top of that to protect it. And this special effect is a perfect match with the Corsair Dominator Special Edition memory. So there are actually 4 SSDs in this build and 2 M.2s, so a lot of storage. So we mounted 2 of the SSDs in the stock mounting position here on the back of the motherboard tray, and the other 2 we put down here in Caselab's SSD tray, which is a good fit down there. It fits in behind the Aquero, which is just right at the front there. So yeah, that all fit quite nicely, still leaving enough room for all of the cables to connect to the back of the PSU. And it's not as tight as these builds usually are. Not running the pump and res combo all the way down into that lower compartment really helped. So you can see the motherboard tray mods a lot better from around the back here. This is actually quite a complex section. There are 3 folds at the front there to get that channel that runs down the front. Now I actually did that more for strength, but it also works out quite nicely to hide cables. So you can see we have one of the splitters here for the top radiator that's nicely hidden there. We have the controller here for the LEDs on the fans at the front, and that's what this is for also. And then we have the other splitter for the front radiator down there in front of the SSDs. And yeah, that's about it. Everything else is fairly straightforward. You can see the SATA data coming through that hole there, and the mounting positions for the ethereal single mounts. It's actually really easy to get that pump and res combo out. Just 4 bolts to undo.